In the late 1990s, in a small, quiet town nestled in rural New York, there were two teenage girls named Rachel and Molly, and they were best friends. They were part of a larger circle of friends, a tight-knit group that navigated the halls of their high school together. But Rachel and Molly had a bond that was a little different, a little deeper. What really drew them together, what formed the core of their friendship and their social circle, was a shared love for goth culture. Now, if you remember the late 90s and the early 2000s, being a goth kid in high school was a very specific identity. It meant a wardrobe composed almost entirely of the color black. It meant black nail polish, black lipstick, and almost always dyed black hair. It was about embracing all things dark and macabre. For some, it was a profound philosophical stance, a way of looking at the world that acknowledged the shadows. For others, it was more of a fashion statement, a way to stand out. But for Rachel and Molly, it was a bit of both. They were committed to the aesthetic, but they also genuinely loved the whole vibe, the art, the music, the literature. It was their world, and one of the central activities in their world, something that became a ritual for them and their friends, was hanging out in the local cemetery. At first, it was almost a joke. They were the goth kids, so of course they would hang out in a cemetery. It felt a little on the nose, a bit of a cliche they wanted to lean into for the sheer irony of it all. So the whole group went out there one evening, almost as a dare to themselves, to fulfill the stereotype. But then, something unexpected happened. They discovered that they actually liked it there. The cemetery was peaceful. It was quiet. It was a place where they could be themselves, away from the judgment of their classmates and the prying eyes of their parents. It became their spot, their go-to hangout, especially on the weekends. Typically, when Rachel, Molly, and the rest of their friends went to the cemetery, they'd go at night. This was partly to maximize the atmosphere, to really lean into the whole dark, gothic aesthetic they loved so much. But there was another, more practical reason they always went as a group. A cemetery at night, no matter how much you romanticize it, is still a little bit creepy. There was a sense of safety in numbers. The laughter and chatter of their friends cut through the silence and kept the deeper, more unsettling feelings at bay. It was fun with a group. It felt safe with a group. So, it was an unspoken rule that Rachel and Molly never went there alone, just the two of them. It was always a package deal, the whole crew or nothing. One particular Friday night, the air was starting to get that cool autumn crispness to it. Rachel was at home, probably listening to music in her room when the phone rang. It was Molly. Her voice was cheerful on the other end of the line. She asked, "Hey, want to go hang out at the cemetery?" And Rachel's immediate thought was, of course, that's what they did on a Friday night. It was the plan. She said, "Duh, I'd love to go. Come pick me up. Let's go." So Rachel got ready. She pulled on her favorite black jeans, a band t-shirt, and her worn-in combat boots. She applied a fresh coat of dark lipstick and waited by the front door. A little while later, she saw the familiar headlights of Molly's car pull into her driveway. But as she walked out, the first thing she noticed was that the car was empty, except for Molly in the driver's seat. There was no one else. Usually the car would be full, a hub of noise and energy as their friends piled in. This was different. Rachel opened the passenger door and slid into the seat, a question already on her lips. She looked over at Molly and asked, "Hey, so where is everybody? Are we going to pick them up now?" Molly gave a little shrug, her hand still on the steering wheel. She said, "Actually, no. I tried calling everyone, but people are either busy or they have to work, or they're still recovering from last night. It's just going to be us two tonight. Is that okay?" And Rachel felt a little knot of unease in her stomach. It wasn't okay, not really. This wasn't how they did things. It wasn't about her trust in Molly. They were as close as sisters. It was about the place. The cemetery. At night. Alone. The idea felt uncomfortable, a little too vulnerable. The safety of the group was a crucial part of the experience, but she looked at Molly, who seemed to have already made peace with the idea. Molly was ready to go, and Rachel didn't want to be the one to back out, to be a buzzkill. She didn't want to be rude, so she pushed her hesitation down and forced a smile. "Oh yeah, that's fine," she said, trying to make her voice sound convincing. "It'll be great. Just the two of us. Let's go." And with that, even with the reluctance lingering in the back of her mind, she settled into her seat. Molly put the car in drive, and they pulled away from the house, heading the short half-mile towards the old cemetery. This cemetery was enormous. It was one of those sprawling, ancient places with tombstones that dated back centuries. As they pulled up to the entrance, the first thing you saw was this huge, medieval-looking gate. It was a massive stone archway that stretched across the entrance road with big, wrought iron gates that were permanently chained open. It was a very gothic, very dramatic entrance, and it set the tone for the whole place. Once you drove through that archway, you were on a long, straight road that cut right through the middle of the cemetery, all the way to the back. It was a huge property, probably over a mile from the front gate to the back fence. This central road effectively split the cemetery into two distinct halves, a right side and a left side, and the spot where Rachel, Molly, and their friends always hung out was in the back left corner. They loved this area for a very specific reason. The left side of the cemetery was full of rolling hills, gentle slopes where the plots were laid out, and in that far back left corner, there was a natural depression in the earth, a shallow little valley. In this depression, there weren't many tombstones. Instead, there was a big moss-covered boulder and a gnarled old tree right next to it. It was a perfect hideaway. If you were standing at the front gate and scanning across the vast expanse of the cemetery, you wouldn't be able to see anyone who was down in that little depression. They were completely tucked away, hidden by the lay of the land. For a group of teenagers looking for a private place to hang out, it was ideal. It was their sanctuary away from the world. So, Rachel and Molly drove through the imposing stone gate, the familiar crunch of gravel under the tires. They made their way down that long central road all the way to the very back of the cemetery. By now, the sun had almost completely set. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the long shadows of the tombstones were melting into the growing darkness. It was quiet, utterly still. There was no one else around, which wasn't unusual. The place was almost always deserted. Occasionally, on the other side of the cemetery, the far right-hand side, some of the college kids from the local university would hop the fence. They had a spot over there where they'd sometimes build a bonfire right up against the fence line. It was totally against the rules, but they would sneak over and do it every now and then. But that was a rare occurrence. Other than those occasional trespassers, the cemetery was their private domain. They reached the end of the road and Molly parked the car. They got out, the car doors closing with a dull thud that seemed incredibly loud in the silence. They walked from the road, across the damp grass, and down the gentle slope into their familiar depression. Once they were at the bottom, they settled into their usual spots. They took up positions on the big boulder, leaning their backs against the rough bark of the old tree. They lit up cigarettes and just started talking. This was their routine. They were just two goth teenagers in rural New York in the late 1990s doing what they did. They talked about everything and nothing. They swapped stories about their boyfriends, complained about teachers, and dissected the latest drama at school. As time passed, the last bit of light faded from the sky, and it became fully dark. A blanket of stars appeared overhead, and in the quiet comfort of their spot, the girls were just having a nice time. Rachel even thought to herself that this was actually kind of nice. It wasn't as scary as she'd imagined it would be. It was just good, quality time with her best friend, but after they'd been there for a while, a new scent drifted to them on the gentle breeze. It was the smell of smoke. Wood smoke. Immediately, their minds went to the college kids, that bonfire spot on the complete opposite side of the cemetery. It was a long way off, but the smell of a bonfire could carry. When they had first arrived, they had glanced over in that direction and hadn't seen anything, but they'd been hanging out for a good while now. It was entirely possible that in the time they'd been down in their depression, a group of students had hopped the fence, started a fire, and that was what they were smelling. Now, a fire on the other side of the cemetery didn't directly affect them. They were on opposite ends of the property. But they knew from experience what a bonfire meant. It meant that, eventually, the police would show up. Someone would eventually see the flames and call it in. The police would come, they would make the college kids put out their fire, and then they would do a full sweep of the entire cemetery to kick out anyone else who was trespassing. That included them. So, Rachel and Molly looked at each other. They didn't even need to say anything. They both had the same thought. They should probably just pack it up and leave now before the cops arrived and made them leave. Besides, they had been there for quite a while. They were getting ready to head home anyway. This just sped up the timeline a bit. It was no big deal. They put out their last cigarettes, gathered their things, and turned to walk back up the hill, back the way they had come, towards the road where Molly's car was parked. As they walked up the grassy slope, they expected to reach the top, crest the hill, and see their car waiting for them. They expected to look out across the vast, dark cemetery and maybe, just maybe, see the distant flicker of the bonfire way off on the other side. But when they reached the top of the hill and their eyes adjusted, that's not what they saw. Their car was there, right where they left it. But when they looked for the fire, it wasn't on the far side of the cemetery at all. Instead, just to their right, maybe 100 meters away, they saw it. There was another depression in the landscape over there, another rolling hill that dipped down out of sight. And rising from that depression, they could see the tops of flickering flames. A fire was burning right there, on their side of the cemetery, practically next to them. This was wrong. This was completely out of the ordinary. They knew for a fact that they were alone on this side when they arrived. There was nobody else here. So, sometime while they were down in their spot, someone else had shown up and started a fire. They had never seen anyone do this over here. It wasn't the college kids' spot. This was something new and it was unsettling. Their first thought was a mix of curiosity and caution. Who was over there? Had the college kids decided to move to a new spot? They couldn't see the person or the people around the fire, only the orange flames licking up over the edge of the hill. They were sure that whoever was over there had no idea that they were right here, just one hill over. A mischievous idea popped into Molly's head. She whispered to Rachel, "What if we go back down and sneak up the other side of our hill? We could peek over and see who it is. We could spy on them." The idea was intriguing. They were already there. Why not? So the two girls turned around and walked back down into the base of their own depression. They passed the big rock and the tree where they had been sitting for the past couple of hours and started walking up the opposite slope, the one that bordered the neighboring depression with the fire. They moved as quietly as they could, trying to be stealthy. As they got closer and closer to the top of the hill, the smell of smoke got stronger and they could hear the soft crackle of the fire. Just as they were about to reach the crest where they would be able to peer over and see everything, Rachel's foot came down on a dry branch. It snapped with a loud crack that seemed to echo in the silent night. The only other sound was the fire. They hadn't heard any voices, no music, no laughter, just the crackle of flames. The sudden noise Rachel made felt like a gunshot. She instantly clapped her hands over her mouth and looked at Molly with wide, apologetic eyes. Molly shot her a look that said, "What are you doing? We're supposed to be sneaking." And then they both just froze. They stood perfectly still, listening, waiting to see if they had been heard, but there was no reaction from the other side of the hill. Just silence. An eerie, heavy silence. And in that moment, the entire mood shifted. The playful, adventurous feeling was gone, replaced by a cold sense of dread. They hadn't even reached the top of the hill yet. They hadn't seen who was at the fire, but something just felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. The two girls looked at each other, and the same thought was reflected in their eyes. Maybe this was a bad idea. Maybe they should just turn around and leave. They both nodded in silent agreement. "Yeah, let's get out of here," one of them whispered. "This doesn't feel right." So right then and there, as quietly as they could, they turned and retreated. They walked back down to the center of their depression, past the rock and the tree, and started walking back up the original side of the hill, the side that led to their car. They were halfway up the slope, their backs to the fire, when for some reason, Rachel glanced back over her shoulder. She looked back towards the hill they had just been on, the one they were trying to spy from. And what she saw made her blood run cold. There was a man standing on the ridgeline now. The fire was behind him, silhouetting his figure, making him a dark, ominous shape against the flickering orange light. He was just standing there, perfectly still, staring directly in their direction. He wasn't saying anything. He was just watching them. It was clear now. He was the one at the fire. He must have heard the noise they made. Rachel's heart leaped into her throat. She whipped her head around and grabbed Molly's arm. "Molly, look, look, look!" she hissed. Molly turned, and her eyes widened in fear. "Let's get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. "We don't know who that is. We have to go, now." And with that, they broke into a frantic, scrambling walk up the rest of the hill. A second later, Rachel risked another look back. The man was no longer on the hill. For a terrifying split second, she thought he was gone. But then she saw movement in the darkness of the depression between the hills. He was running, he was coming down the hill, and he was coming right for them. The girls started screaming. Pure, instinctual terror. They stopped walking and started sprinting, their feet stumbling on the uneven ground. They ran for the car, their lungs burning. Rachel kept looking back, and the man was gaining on them. He was fast. They finally reached the road, their feet pounding on the asphalt. They scrambled to Molly's car, yanking on the door handles. They jumped inside, slammed the doors shut, and fumbled to lock them. Molly jammed the key into the ignition, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn it. The engine roared to life. She threw the car into reverse, then into drive, and stomped on the gas pedal. The tires squealed as they sped away down the long, dark cemetery road. As they were driving, Rachel looked out the back window one last time. She saw the man. He had reached the road just a few feet from where their car had been. He had almost caught them. He stood there for a moment, watching them drive away, and then he slowly, deliberately turned and walked back down the hill. Disappearing into the darkness, they were both completely shaken up. Their hearts were pounding, and they were breathing in ragged gasps. That was not a college kid. That was a grown man, maybe in his 40s, someone they had never seen before. The whole situation was just so creepy, so wrong. They didn't know what to make of it. As Molly drove Rachel home, the adrenaline started to wear off, replaced by a shaky confusion. What would have happened if he had reached them? What did he want? What was he doing out there with a fire all by himself? But by the time Molly pulled up to Rachel's house, they had started to process the fear by turning it into a crazy story. They were trying to downplay it, to make it seem less terrifying than it was. "Man, that was crazy, huh?" Molly said, trying to laugh it off. They chalked it up to just a weird, scary night. A story they'd tell their friends on Monday. A warning to themselves to never go to the cemetery alone again. Rachel got out of the car and went inside her house. She didn't even tell her mom what had happened. She was still too wired and confused. She just put her stuff down, went to her room, and tried to calm her racing heart. Molly drove to her own house and did the same. She didn't tell anyone. She just went to her room and eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, Rachel woke up feeling groggy. She went downstairs to the kitchen to get some breakfast. Her mom was already in there going about her morning routine, making coffee. When she saw Rachel, she smiled and asked casually, "Hey, how was your night last night?" Rachel just shrugged. "Oh, it was fine. Me and Malthy went out. Nothing special." Her mom nodded, then her expression turned a bit more serious. "Oh, did you hear what happened last night?" she asked. Rachel shook her head. "No, what do you mean?" "What happened?" Her mom took a sip of her coffee. Well, she said, a woman in our town was kidnapped. She paused for a moment. She was actually taken from the same parking garage where I park for work. She worked in the same building as me. Rachel felt a jolt of alarm. Oh my God, she said. What happened to her? Did they find her? Rachel's mom looked at her and her face was grim. No, she said softly. Unfortunately, it was too late. When they found her, she was dead. And then she delivered the final, devastating piece of information. In fact, whoever kidnapped and killed her, they brought her body to the local cemetery last night, and they burned her in a huge bonfire. Her mom's voice dropped to a whisper, and they still haven't caught the person who did it. When Rachel heard those words, it was like the entire world tilted on its axis. Everything came crashing down. Suddenly, she understood exactly what had happened the night before. That fire wasn't just a fire. That man wasn't just some random creep. He was the killer. That fire they had smelled, the one they had almost walked right up to, it very likely contained the body of that poor woman. They had been right there, no more than 100 meters away while this horrific act was taking place. It was even more terrifying to realize that they were probably there when the killer first arrived, when he set everything up, when he started that fire. And the most chilling thought of all, what would have happened if he had caught them? What was he trying to do when he chased them? Was he trying to silence the only witnesses to his crime? A wave of nausea washed over Rachel. She started to tremble and she poured her heart out to her mom. She told her everything, about Molly calling, about going to the cemetery alone, about the strange fire, about the man on the hill, about the terrifying chase to the car. Her mom listened, her face growing paler with every word. When Rachel finished, her mom was horrified. Oh my God, she said, pulling Rachel into a hug. I can't believe this happened. You have to tell the police. They haven't caught this guy yet. You saw him. You have a description of him. You have to talk to them. So that's what they did. Rachel immediately got on the phone and called Molly, telling her what she had just learned. Molly became hysterical on the other end, crying, barely able to speak. They couldn't believe how close they had come to a truly terrible fate. They went to the police station together. They sat down with a detective and told him everything they could remember about the man. Unfortunately, their description wasn't much to go on. It had been dark, and they had been terrified. All they could really say was that he looked to be about average height, maybe in his 40s. It wasn't a lot for the police to work with, but it was something, and luckily they wouldn't have to rely on that description alone. Just 48 hours later, the police got the break they needed. It wasn't because of the girl's description, but because of a bit of luck and good police work. An officer on patrol spotted the victim's car being driven around town. A BOLO, a be on the lookout alert, had been issued for the vehicle. The officer pulled the car over, and the person behind the wheel was the killer. After he was arrested, he made a full confession to the kidnapping and the murder. Rachel and Molly were safe. The man who had chased them was behind bars. But they would never forget that night. They thought back to that moment when Rachel accidentally stepped on the branch, making that loud noise. At the time, it felt like a stupid mistake, a clumsy move that could have gotten them caught spying. But now, they realized it was the sound that had likely saved their lives. That noise made them pause, it made them feel uneasy, it made them rethink their decision and turn back. If that hadn't happened, if they had continued up and over that hill, they would have come face to face with a killer in the middle of him disposing of a body. And it's almost certain that two teenage girls, the only witnesses to his crime, would have ended up in that bonfire as well. Their favorite hangout spot, a place they once saw as a sanctuary of ironic coolness, was now forever tainted by the memory of what they almost stumbled into, and the terrifying reality of the darkness that can hide in the most familiar places. Stories like this are terrifying because they remind us how close ordinary people can come to extraordinary evil without ever realizing it. One normal Friday night, one familiar place, one small decision, and suddenly everything changes. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Sometimes the darkest moments don't begin with screams or warning signs. Sometimes they begin in silence. Until next time. Tab 1 on January 1st of 2015, a family in South Yorkshire, England, gathered at a local restaurant for their annual New Year Day lunch. This was a long-standing tradition for them, a time to come together after the holidays, share a warm meal, and talk about their hopes and plans for the upcoming year. But on this particular afternoon, there was one member of the family who was noticeably missing. His name was Stephen Winfrey. Stephen was 50 years old, he was unemployed, and he was a divorced father of two. In recent years, Stephen had fallen into a very deep, dark depression. He struggled to find motivation, and he often isolated himself from the people who cared about him the most. Because of this, when the family noticed his empty chair at the restaurant, they immediately felt a wave of anxiety. They tried calling his mobile phone, but it just rang and rang before going straight to voicemail. At this point, the family started to panic. Given Stephen's fragile mental state and his history with depression, their minds immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. They began to worry that he might have done something to harm himself, but then Stephen's sister, Nadine, who was sitting at the table, stepped in to calm everyone down. She reassured the rest of the family that there was no need to panic just yet. She explained that she had actually spoken to Stephen the night before, on New Year's Eve, and he had been in incredibly great spirits. During their conversation, Stephen told her that his plan for the next morning was to wake up early and go rabbit hunting in a nearby forested park. After he finished hunting, he was going to head straight over to the restaurant to join them for lunch. Nadine knew that her brother had recently taken a real liking to rabbit hunting. It was one of the very few hobbies that actually brought him genuine joy and made him smile. So, she told the family that she would bet anything he had simply lost track of time out in the woods. She suggested that he was probably just running late and would show up at any minute, or perhaps he would miss the lunch entirely, but at least he was out there doing something that made him truly happy. Hearing this, the family felt a sense of relief. They decided to trust Nadine's instincts. They sat down, ordered their food, and began to eat. Throughout the entire meal, people kept glancing over at the front door of the restaurant, expecting to see Stephen walk through the entrance with a big smile on his face, offering some excuse for being late. But as the lunch came to an end and the plates were cleared away, Stephen still had not arrived. As the family gathered their coats and prepared to leave the restaurant to head back to their respective homes, they talked about the situation once more. They agreed that Stephen was likely fine, just deeply engrossed in his hunting, and they decided the best thing to do was to go home and wait for him to make contact on his own terms. So, they all went their separate ways. But by the following morning, which was January 2nd, the worry returned. The family members began calling and texting each other, only to discover that still, absolutely no one had seen or heard from Stephen. He had not returned to his home and his phone was still going straight to voicemail. At this point, they knew deep down that something was seriously wrong. They contacted the local police and officially reported Stephen Winfrey as a missing person. The police began gathering information and were preparing to launch a search party in the area. But before they could even get their search teams fully organized, they received a sudden phone call. Stephen had been found, but unfortunately it was not the news the family had been praying for. Although the exact minute-by-minute details of what happened to Stephen out in those woods may never be fully understood, the police were able to piece together a highly detailed and incredibly tragic theory based on the physical evidence at the scene. On New Year Day, early in the morning, Stephen had indeed gone out to the nearby forested park to do some rabbit hunting, just like he had told his sister he would. He had brought along his dog and a few of his ferrets. The specific way Stephen hunted rabbits involved a traditional method. He would locate various rabbit holes in the ground, and then he would release his ferrets into these openings. Ferrets are natural predators of rabbits, and they are incredibly agile underground. Once inside the tunnels, the ferrets would run through the network of holes, chasing the rabbits and forcing them to flee out into the open. Stephen would stand back at a distance, holding his rifle, waiting patiently for the rabbits to bolt out of their holes. The moment a rabbit emerged, Stephen would raise his rifle and shoot, and then his dog would run over, retrieve the rabbit, and bring it back to him. According to the police investigation, Stephen had been doing this all morning with a fair amount of success. But at some point during the hunt, something went wrong. The police believe that either one of Stephen's ferrets got stuck deep inside a rabbit hole, or perhaps a rabbit had become wedged in the opening, blocking the path. Whatever the case was, Stephen decided he needed to take a closer look inside one of these rabbit holes. He walked over to the opening, but because it was dark and narrow, he could not see anything from a standing or crouching position. So, Stephen got down on his hands and knees on the cold, damp ground. He leaned forward and decided to stick his head directly into the opening of the rabbit hole to peer inside. The problem was that the entrance to this rabbit hole was extremely narrow, and the ground was tightly packed. Once Stephen forced his head inside the opening, his head became tightly wedged. When he tried to pull himself backward, he realized with horror that he was stuck. He could not get his head out. The physical evidence left behind at the scene painted a terrifying picture of what happened next. All around the outside of the hole, the police found deep, frantic divots in the dirt. These divots had been dug by Stephen's bare hands. Once he realized he was trapped, he had desperately clawed at the frozen earth, trying to dig the entrance of the hole wider so he could free his head. But as he worked frantically, gasping for breath and laboring under extreme physical exertion, he was rapidly burning up the very limited amount of oxygen that was trapped inside that narrow hole. Very quickly, the air began to run out. As Stephen struggled to breathe, the panic must have intensified. Realizing that digging with his hands was not working fast enough and that he was starting to suffocate, Stephen abandoned that approach. He began to violently contort his body on the outside of the hole. He twisted and turned his torso and legs at incredibly extreme angles, trying to use the weight and leverage of his entire body to pop his head free from the earth, even if it meant breaking his own neck in the process. But no matter how hard he struggled, the packed earth would not give way. The next afternoon, on January 2nd, at around 4 in the afternoon, a local resident was walking through the forested park. As they walked along, they noticed something strange in the distance. They walked closer and were shocked to see a man's body protruding from a hole in the ground at a highly unusual and extreme angle. The walker immediately called the police. When the emergency services arrived, they confirmed that Stephen was dead. The medical examiner later determined that he had died of suffocation. His death was officially ruled a tragic and bizarre accident rather than a suicide. As for Stephen's dog and his ferrets, they were found waiting faithfully near his body, completely unhurt. Before we move on to our next story, I want to take a moment to talk about today's sponsor, Current. Nowadays, virtually everything we do in our daily lives is done either exclusively online, or we have a very convenient option to do it online. I think we can all agree that this represents massive progress. Personally, I opt for the online option virtually every single time, whether I am ordering food, buying gear, or managing my schedule. But there is one major area of our lives that has seemed remarkably slow to evolve, and that is banking. It is truly shocking to me that even today, many traditional banks still require us to physically go into one of their brick-and-mortar locations just to handle basic aspects of our accounts. I do not know about you, but I absolutely do not like the idea of sitting in front of a bank representative, feeling rushed and stressed while making major financial decisions, especially when there is literally a line of people waiting behind me. It is incredibly inconvenient. But after signing up with Current, which is a fantastic mobile banking app, all of those headaches disappeared. Once you sign up, they send you your very own custom debit card, and after that, absolutely everything is done online through their sleek app. They have an amazing rewards program, and they also feature a great savings program called Savings Pods, which helps you organize and grow your money easily. There is no more pressure, no more waiting in lines, and no more inconvenience. It is just money management done exclusively online, the way it honestly should be. And right now, Current and I are teaming up to give away $10,000 to you guys. The way it works is very simple. You just go download the Current app using the code MrBallen, and once you do, you could be one of 20 lucky people who will receive $500 directly from this promotion. It is a great opportunity, so make sure to check it out. Now let us get back to our stories. Brian Joplin was born in 1972 and was raised in a very small, close-knit town in Oklahoma called Hugo. Growing up, Brian was a very big, solid guy, and because of his impressive size, his peers and coaches always encouraged him to play football. Brian did play, and he was quite good at it, but football was never his true passion. His real love had always been working on cars. He loved the smell of the garage, the sound of a powerful engine, and the satisfaction of fixing things with his hands. He was an exceptionally skilled mechanic, even at a young age. After he graduated from high school, Brian decided to stick around Hugo for a while, working at a local auto body shop. But as the months passed, he began to get this nagging feeling that he was meant to do something much bigger and more impactful with his life. So, in 1992, he made the decision to enlist in the United States Navy. This was a moment of immense pride for his entire family, but especially for his grandfather. Brian's grandfather had flown bomber planes during World War II, and seeing his grandson step up to serve his country meant the world to him. After Brian completed his initial military training, which is commonly known as boot camp, he was selected to attend Aviation Machinist Mate School. This is a highly specialized military technical school that teaches sailors how to maintain, troubleshoot, and repair all the complex mechanical systems on military aircraft. Because Brian was already a highly talented mechanic before he ever joined the Navy, the school was a breeze for him. The complex concepts came to him completely naturally. Once he graduated from the aviation school, the Navy sent him to his very first duty station, which was located out in California. Brian joined his new aviation unit and immediately stood out. Even though he was one of the most junior sailors in the entire hangar, he quickly became recognized as one of the single best mechanics in the unit. While he was stationed in California, Brian's personal life also began to flourish. He met a woman named Belinda, and the two fell deeply in love and got married. Over the next several years, Brian's military career took the family to Texas and a few other locations. Through it all, Brian continued to shine both at work and at home. He and Belinda started building a beautiful family, eventually welcoming 2 daughters into the world. By all accounts, Brian's life was going exactly according to plan. He had a great career, a loving wife, and beautiful children. But then Brian made a terrible mistake. Fast forward to October 4th of 2005. Brian was 32 years old at the time, and he was currently deployed with his unit to the country of Bahrain, which is a small island nation located in the Persian Gulf. On that particular day, Brian, along with 2 other mechanics from his unit and 2 Navy pilots, had been tasked with a routine mission. They were scheduled to fly from their base in Bahrain north to Kuwait, which is another nation bordering the Persian Gulf. This was a very routine flight, lasting only about an hour. It was a trip that the crew had already made multiple times during this deployment, and because of that, no one was particularly excited about it. In fact, Brian and the other crew members were dreading the flight because they knew it would be incredibly monotonous and boring. But Brian decided that he was going to find a way to make this trip a little more interesting. He decided he was going to perform a stunt. Brian and the other 2 mechanics loaded their gear into the cargo area, which is the large passenger cabin in the back of the military helicopter. Meanwhile, the 2 pilots climbed into the cockpit up front. Within a matter of minutes, the helicopter lifted off the ground, climbed to an altitude of 125 feet, and began careening forward out over the open waters of the Persian Gulf at a speed of over 120 miles per hour. For this flight, Brian and the other 2 mechanics had decided to keep the large rear loading ramp of the helicopter in the down position. This ramp folds up and down to allow cargo and personnel to enter and exit, but keeping it open during flight is actually a very common practice in the military. Flying with the ramp down or the side doors open provides the crew with an absolutely incredible, unobstructed view of the landscape below, and more importantly, it lets a massive, refreshing breeze sweep through the hot cabin. A few minutes into the flight, when the helicopter was far out over the blue waters of the Persian Gulf, Brian decided that it was the perfect time to perform his stunt. He looked across the loud cabin at the other 2 mechanics. Because of the deafening roar of the helicopter engines and the rushing wind, it was impossible to hear anyone speak unless they used their military headsets. But Brian and his fellow mechanics had no intention of talking about this stunt over the headsets because they did not want the pilots in the cockpit to know what they were up to. So, Brian simply used hand signals to communicate with his buddies. They were completely in on the plan, and when they saw Brian's signal, they both grinned. One of the mechanics immediately reached into his pocket and pulled out a camera, holding it up and getting ready to capture the moment. Then Brian did something incredibly dangerous. He reached down and disconnected his official military helicopter safety lanyard. Inside any military helicopter, there are numerous heavy-duty metal rings called eyelets secured tightly to the floor, walls, and ceiling. These eyelets are designed to secure cargo, but they are also meant to secure the people inside. Sailors wear a specialized heavy-duty safety belt that has a thick strap coming off the front of it. At the end of this strap is a locking carabiner, which they clip onto one of the metal eyelets on the floor. This lanyard is designed to keep you from falling out of the aircraft in the event of sudden turbulence, a sharp turn, or a sudden loss of altitude. But instead of using this approved safety gear, Brian reached for a piece of gear that had been custom-made for this stunt. It was a length of simple nylon rope that had been rigged to look like a crude safety harness. On one end of this 10-foot rope, there was a metal carabiner, and on the other end, there was a loop tied with a slip knot. Brian, or perhaps one of his buddies, had constructed this rope harness specifically for this stunt. Brian took the loop end of the rope, put it over his head, pulled it down to his waist, and then cinched the slip knot tight around his midsection. Then he carefully stood up in the shaking helicopter and walked toward the open rear ramp. He bent down and clipped the carabiner end of the 10-foot nylon rope into one of the metal eyelets on the cabin floor, right where the floor transitions into the downward-sloping ramp. With the crude safety line secured to the helicopter, Brian turned back, looked at the other 2 mechanics, and gave them one final thumbs up. Then he got down on his hands and knees and began slowly crawling backward down the open ramp. When he reached the very edge of the ramp, where the metal met the open air and the rushing wind, Brian reached out with his left hand and grabbed one of the metal rings built into the ramp itself, securing a tight grip. Then, with his right hand, he reached over and gripped the metal framing on the side of the ramp. Once he felt confident in his hold, Brian slowly lowered his legs and his lower torso off the edge of the ramp into the empty air. The moment his legs cleared the metal ramp, the powerful 120-mile-per-hour wind rushing beneath the helicopter immediately swept his legs upward, holding them completely horizontal in the air, making him look as if he were flying. Brian kept his arms tucked tight near his chest, holding on for dear life, but once he felt his body stabilize in the wind, he slowly extended his arms forward. He was now officially doing what the crew called the Superman stunt. The moment Brian was in this horizontal flying position, the mechanic with the camera leaned forward and began snapping photos of him hanging off the back of the aircraft. Brian knew he was getting his picture taken, and he braced himself against the incredible force of the wind, holding on as tight as he possibly could. After a few moments, the photos were done, and the mechanic gave Brian a thumbs-up signal to let him know he could come back inside. Brian began trying to pull his body back up onto the metal ramp. But as he tried to pull himself against the relentless force of the wind, his hands slipped the instant he lost his grip. The 120-mile-per-hour wind violently whipped his body backward, away from the helicopter. The only thing that prevented him from instantly plummeting to the water below was the crude nylon rope tied around his waist. Brian desperately tried to reach out and grab the ramp again, but the wind had pushed him too far away, and he was now dangling helplessly behind the helicopter. As the wind pulled his body backward with immense force, the nylon rope around his waist began to slide upward. It slid up his torso until it stopped directly under his armpits, wrapping tightly around his chest. At this point, Brian knew that if he raised his arms, the rope would slide right over his shoulders and off his body, and he would fall to his death. So he kept his arms pinned tightly to his sides, trying to keep the rope in place. But because the rope had been tied with a slip knot, the massive drag of the wind pulling his body away from the helicopter caused the knot to tighten. The rope squeezed his chest tighter and tighter, compressing his lungs and making it completely impossible for him to draw a breath. Within seconds, the lack of oxygen caused Brian to lose consciousness. The moment Brian passed out, his entire body went completely limp. His arms, which had been pinned to his sides to hold the rope in place, fell away and went loose. With nothing holding the rope down, the powerful wind whipped his limp arms over his head, and the nylon loop instantly slid up over his shoulders, off his head, and completely off his body. Brian Joplin fell 125 feet through the air, crashing into the Persian Gulf below, where he died. Following a thorough military investigation into the tragedy, at least 8 service members were disciplined and punished for their involvement in the incident, including the 2 mechanics who had watched and photographed the stunt. However, the exact details of their punishments were never made public. In the late 1860s, a group of rugged American explorers emerged from the deep wilderness of Wyoming and went straight to a local newspaper office. They claimed they had discovered an absolutely otherworldly, magical place, and they wanted to share their story with the world. The newspaper editors sat down with their notepads, and the explorers began describing this unbelievable landscape. They said they had found a massive wilderness, and right in the middle of it, there were giant, boiling lakes that were colored neon green, bright yellow, and deep red. They claimed that some of these lakes would violently shoot columns of boiling water high into the sky, and they described breathtaking waterfalls, majestic snow-capped mountains, and massive herds of bison, elk, wolves, and bears roaming completely free. The newspaper editors listened to this incredible description, took down all the notes, and then politely told the explorers that they were sorry, but their newspaper did not publish science fiction. But as we know today, those explorers were not lying. They were describing an area that would eventually become Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone is a massive expanse of protected wilderness that sits directly on top of an active supervolcano. Those boiling neon-colored lakes are very real, and they are known as geothermal hot springs. They are the direct result of groundwater flowing deep beneath the earth and making contact with massive underground magma chambers, heating the water to extreme temperatures. Today, Yellowstone is one of the most popular tourist destinations in the world, drawing millions of visitors every single year. Because of this massive influx of tourists, the park has to employ hundreds of workers year-round to keep everything running smoothly. Many of these seasonal employees are young college students who travel from all over the country to work there for the summer. To make things easier for these young workers, the park offers them very low-cost or even free housing inside the park. These are essentially dormitory-style buildings spaced out across the park, allowing the employees to live right on site near their workstations. In the summer of 2000, a 20-year-old college student named Sarah Helfers was working as a seasonal employee at Yellowstone, and she was staying in one of these employee dormitories. One afternoon, Sarah was relaxing in her room on her day off when she heard a knock on her door. She opened it to find a group of her fellow summer employees standing in the hallway. They told her that they were planning to go swimming in a nearby river, and they asked if she wanted to come along. Sarah did not have any other plans, so she happily agreed. She put on her bathing suit, grabbed a towel, packed some snacks, and joined the group. They piled into a couple of cars and drove over to a dirt parking lot that sat right on the edge of a dense, expansive forest. They parked their cars, got out, and located a trailhead that led directly into the thick trees. The group walked along this forest trail for a while until the path finally cleared, bringing them out onto the banks of a beautiful river known as the Firehole River. The river got its unique name because during certain times the surface of the water would steam, giving the distinct impression that the river was actually on fire. The reason for this steam was that some of the water feeding into the Firehole River passed near the underground magma chambers, warming the river up. Unlike the boiling hot springs, however, this river was only mildly warm, making it completely safe and incredibly comfortable for swimming. Sarah and her friends walked down to the edge of the water and jumped in. They had an absolutely fantastic afternoon, swimming around, splashing each other, and playing games. They had originally planned to only stay for a couple of hours, but they were having so much fun that they completely lost track of time. Before they knew it, the sun had fully set, and darkness had completely blanketed the area. They finally climbed out of the river and began drying off with their towels, but they quickly realized they had a serious problem. Because they had not planned on staying past sunset, absolutely no one had brought a flashlight. To get back to their cars in the dirt lot, they would have to walk back through the dense forest trail. But without any light, the forest was pitch black, making it incredibly easy to trip, get lost, or run into some of the large, dangerous wildlife that roamed the park at night. The group debated what to do. Eventually, about half of the group decided that they would just run down the forest trail as fast as they could, hoping to reach the cars quickly and assuming they would be fine. But the other half of the group was too nervous about entering the dark woods. They decided to look for an alternative route that would skirt around the edge of the forest, allowing them to use the natural light of the moon to guide their way. This second group consisted of Sarah Helfers and two 18-year-old boys named Lance Bucci and Tyler Montague. Sarah, Lance, and Tyler stood on the riverbank and watched the first group run into the dark forest and disappear. Then, the three of them turned to the right and began walking downstream, keeping the dark line of the forest on their left and the open river on their right. They walked for a while, and eventually, they noticed that the tree line on their left seemed to be thinning out. They saw this as an opportunity to cut to the left and make a straight path toward where they believed the parking lot was located. They made the turn and began walking across a massive open field. The terrain was flat and relatively easy to navigate, with only a few scattered trees. The moonlight was bright, providing them with great visibility, and they felt incredibly relieved that they had chosen this safer, easier path. But as they continued walking, they noticed a series of small, narrow streams cutting across the field ahead of them. They reached the first stream, which was very narrow, and they easily jumped right over it. A short distance later, they encountered a second stream, which was also small, and they jumped over that one with no trouble at all. Then they came to a third stream. This one was still relatively small, but it was noticeably wider than the first two they had crossed. If they miscalculated their jump, they risked landing right in the water. This would not have been a massive tragedy as they were already damp from swimming, but they still wanted to avoid getting soaked again. They considered walking along the edge of the stream to find a narrower spot to cross, but they estimated that they were only about 100 or 200 feet away from the parking lot. They could not see the cars yet, but they knew they were extremely close, and they did not want to wander farther away just to find a crossing. So they decided they would just jump over it together. They figured that if they fell in, and it would not be a big deal. The three of them backed up a few feet from the edge of the stream to give themselves some running room. They lined up side by side, reached out, and tightly grabbed each other's hands. On the count of 3, they ran forward and leaped together across the dark water. They managed to clear the span of the water, and all three of them landed on the far bank. But the ground where they landed was made of loose, soft, muddy soil. The moment their feet hit the bank, the ground crumbled beneath them, causing them to lose their footing and slip backward. All three of them fell backward, directly into the dark stream. In the dim moonlight, this stream had looked identical to the other safe, cool streams they had just crossed. But this particular stream was not normal water. It was actually the direct runoff channel from a nearby geothermal hot spring. The water in this stream was a staggering 178 degrees Fahrenheit, which is practically boiling. Furthermore, while the stream looked shallow, it was actually a deep 10-foot channel. The moment the three teenagers hit the scalding water, they let out blood-curdling screams of pure agony. The first group of friends, who had successfully run through the forest trail, were waiting by the cars in the parking lot when they heard the terrifying screams echoing across the field. They immediately turned and ran full speed in the direction of the noise. Cutting through the edge of the woods and out into the open field, they arrived at the edge of the runoff stream and were horrified to find Lance and Tyler desperately trying to pull Sarah out of the deep, scalding water. The friends rushed forward, grabbed Sarah, and helped pull her onto the grassy bank. At first, they did not understand what was happening, but as Lance, Tyler, and Sarah continued to scream in excruciating pain, they realized the water was boiling. One of the friends immediately ran back to the parking lot, jumped into a car, and drove to get help. It was not long before a rescue helicopter arrived at the scene. The paramedics quickly loaded Sarah, Lance, and Tyler into the helicopter and flew them to a specialized burn unit at a nearby hospital. When Lance and Tyler had fallen into the water, they had only submerged up to their necks. The moment they hit the hot water, their instincts kicked in, and they immediately scrambled back out onto the bank. This split-second reaction ultimately saved their lives. However, they still suffered severe, life-altering burns over nearly their entire bodies. They had to undergo dozens of painful skin graft surgeries, spend years in intensive physical rehabilitation, and face astronomical medical bills. They survived, but their lives were changed forever. Sarah, however, was not as fortunate. When she fell backward into the deep stream, she had completely submerged. Her head, her face, and her entire body went under the scalding water, and she was unable to get herself out as quickly as the boys. She remained trapped in the boiling runoff for much longer. When she arrived at the hospital, she was surprisingly conscious and able to talk, but the doctors quickly realized the devastating severity of her injuries. In medicine, a third-degree burn is also known as a full-thickness burn. This means that the heat has completely destroyed the outer layer of skin, as well as the deeper layers of tissue beneath it. This includes the destruction of the vital cells that are responsible for regenerating and growing new skin. Because of this, third-degree burns cannot heal on their own. The only way to treat them is through a skin graft, which is essentially a skin transplant where doctors harvest healthy, unburned skin from other parts of the patient's body and surgically place it over the burned areas. But when the surgeons examined Sarah, they discovered that she had suffered severe third-degree burns over 100% of her body. There was not a single patch of healthy, unburned skin left on her entire body to use for a graft. Her body was completely devastated by the extreme heat. Despite the medical team's desperate, around-the-clock efforts to stabilize her, Sarah Helfers passed away 15 hours after arriving at the hospital. A year after the tragedy, Lance Bucci's family filed a lawsuit against the National Park Service. They argued that the park had been negligent by failing to put up warning signs or barriers near that specific hot spring runoff stream to warn visitors of the extreme danger. However, a judge ultimately dismissed the lawsuit. The court ruled that the National Park Service was not responsible because Sarah, Lance, and Tyler had voluntarily chosen to walk off the designated safety trails in an area that was clearly marked and widely known as a dangerous thermal zone, making their own actions negligent. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On New Year's Day, Stephen Winfrey vanished before a family lunch in South Yorkshire. His relatives feared the worst, but his sister said he was only rabbit hunting in the woods, a hobby that had finally made him happy again. The next day, a walker found something horrifying, Stephen's body sticking out of a narrow rabbit hole. At first, no suspect made sense. Then investigators saw the claw marks in the frozen dirt. The twist? Stephen had trapped his own head while trying to look inside the hole, suffocating as his dog and ferrets waited nearby. A bizarre accident, but the full story is even darker. Visit the channel to watch more mysterious cases.